The first thing Clara Morrow noticed every morning was not the light. There was no light worth noticing in November in the Montana Territory, not at 4 in the morning, when the darkness pressed against the shuttered windows like something alive and patient. What she noticed first was the silence, and then immediately after the silence, the cold. Not the cold of a room that had grown chilly overnight, the manageable kind that yields to a stoked fire and a warm shawl. This was the cold of something fundamentally wrong, the cold of a system that had been failing slowly and was now failing fast. And the distinction mattered because one kind of cold could be fixed, and the other kind could not with the tools she currently had. She lay still for 3 seconds after waking. This was a habit she had developed not from discipline, but from dread, those 3 seconds being the last moment in each day when she could pretend in the gray half-consciousness between sleep and full awareness that things were different than they were. Then she opened her eyes and the pretending was over. Her breath hung in front of her face in a cloud that dissipated slowly in the still air. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals, which meant she had slept longer than she intended, which meant the cabin had been losing heat for hours, which meant the floorboards were now at whatever temperature the earth beneath them had settled into overnight. She already knew what that temperature was. She had been learning it every morning for 3 weeks. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and placed her bare feet on the floor. The boards were so cold they felt wet. They were not wet. They were simply at a temperature that the human body interprets as moisture. Because the mind confronted with something it cannot immediately categorize reaches for the nearest available comparison. Clara had learned this about cold, the way she had learned most things about difficult subjects. Not from books or from other people's explanations, but from sustained and unavoidable contact with the thing itself. The water bucket beside the hearth was frozen solid. Not a skim of ice at the top, not the soft giving resistance of water that has begun to crystallize, but can still be broken with a finger. Solid. She lifted the bucket and turned it upside down and nothing moved. She set it back down and stood looking at it for a moment in the dim orange light of the dying coals. And then she turned and crossed to the children's corner of the cabin, without making a sound. Lily was 8 years old and had her father's way of sleeping, arms thrown wide, one leg kicked free of the blankets, her dark hair spread across the pillow, in total abandon, as though sleep was something she had thrown herself into headlong, rather than drifted into gently. Her cheeks had the particular pallor that came not from a single cold night, but from weeks of sustained exposure, the kind that settles into skin and begins to look less like a temporary condition and more like a permanent one. Beside her, Owen slept the way he did, everything carefully, with his blankets pulled up to his chin and his small fists curled beneath them, as though even in sleep he was holding on to something. His breathing was audible from 3 feet away. Not labored, not yet, but present in a way that healthy breathing is not each exhale carrying a faint roughness at the back of it, like a word almost spoken. Clara stood over him and listened to that sound for a long moment, measuring it against the morning before, calculating whether it was the same or worse. This morning, it was the same. This morning, she would take. She crossed to the hearth and began rebuilding the fire with the methodical efficiency of someone who has performed a task so many times it no longer requires conscious direction. Split pine on the coals, birch bark tucked into the gaps, the bellows worked in slow, steady strokes until the flames caught and began to move with purpose. The cabin light shifted from dim orange to something warmer and more alive, and Clara sat back on her heels and watched the fire establish itself, and thought about the problem she had been thinking about for 3 weeks. The cabin was 14 feet wide and 18 feet long. Thomas had built it in the spring of 1885, 2 years before he died, working with 2 other men from the settlement in a 3-day raising that had left him proud in the particular quiet way he was proud of things. Not boastful but settled, as though the cabin's existence confirmed something he had needed confirmed about himself. He had done the work properly. The logs were well fitted, the chinking solid, the river stone chimney drawing clean. The floorboards were cedar tight-jointed, laid over a frame that sat 6 inches above the ground on corner posts. It was a good cabin by the standards of the Montana Territory in 1885. Clara had never disputed that. The problem was the 6 inches. The space between the floor and the ground was not a crawl space in any useful sense. It was a channel. At night, when the temperature dropped and the wind came down from the northern ridges and moved across the valley floor, it found that channel and it ran through it the way water finds a stream bed, naturally, inevitably, with the focused efficiency of any force moving along the path of least resistance. The wind under the cabin floor was not the same wind that rattled the shutters and piled snow against the woodshed. It was colder, faster, more concentrated, a wind that had been narrowed and accelerated by the 6-inch gap until it moved with something like intention. And what it intended every night from late October until sometime in March was to pull heat through the floorboards and carry it away into the dark. Clara had understood this for weeks. She had arrived at the understanding the way she arrived at most understandings about physical problems, not through abstract reasoning, but through careful observation of specific symptoms. The frost on the inside of the floorboards each morning, the way the children's feet were always coldest even when the rest of them had warmed, the way the fire in the hearth could burn for 2 hours and raise the air temperature of the room to something tolerable, while the floor remained at a temperature that made walking across it feel like a small punishment. Heat rises. Everyone knew that. What people less often considered was the equal and opposite truth that cold falls and that a floor pressed against a column of moving frozen air acts not as a barrier to cold, but as a conductor of it, drawing warmth down through the boards and offering it up to the wind as steadily as a candle offers light to a dark room. She had tried the remedies that the settlement's collective wisdom offered. Old Silas, who had been in Montana longer than almost anyone, and whose opinions were delivered with the absolute authority of age and survival, had suggested packing straw beneath the floor. Clara had done it. The straw helped for approximately 2 weeks before the moisture in the frozen ground wickered up into it and turned it first damp and then, on the coldest nights, into something close to solid ice. Ruth Halsey had suggested hanging canvas around the foundation to block the wind, and Clara had done that too, cutting apart a damaged tent she found in the back of the woodshed and nailing the canvas in strips around the cabin's perimeter. It reduced the draft by perhaps a third. It was not enough. She had burned more firewood than she had planned to burn by November, eating into reserves she had calculated would last until February. And even with the extra burning, water left in the wash basin overnight froze solid before dawn. The morning she found Owen's left foot blue at the toes, she had been standing at the hearth, heating water for cornmeal. She heard Lily's sharp intake of breath, not a cry. Lily was not a child who cried easily, but a sound of involuntary alarm. And Clara crossed the room and unwrapped the blanket from Owen's feet and looked at what she found there without speaking. His toes were not frostbitten, not truly. The color was the color of cold rather than the color of tissue damage, and when she rubbed his foot briskly between her palms, the blue faded to pink within minutes. But she had stood there holding his small foot in both her hands and looked at the color that had been in it, and felt something in her chest that was not fear exactly, but was in the same family as fear. The feeling of watching a margin that had already been too small shrink by another degree. It was 3 days after that morning that she found the copy of The Prairie Farmer. Thomas had kept a wooden box under the bed, a rough pine box with a hasp but no lock. And inside it, he had kept the papers and objects that mattered to him enough to preserve but not enough to display. Letters from his brother in Wisconsin never answered. The deed to the cabin. A photograph of his parents taken in a studio in St. Louis in 1871. The two of them seated and unsmiling in their Sunday clothes with the rigid dignity of people who have been told not to move and are obeying with everything they have. A dog-eared almanac from 1883. And beneath all of that, folded twice and soft at the creases from repeated handling, a single page torn from a copy of The Prairie Farmer, dated September 1879. The article was about dugout construction on the Nebraska plains. It was not a long piece, half a column, maybe 200 words written in the plain declarative style of agricultural journalism. No poetry, no sentiment, just information assembled for practical use. It described how families moving into the treeless stretches of central Nebraska in the 1870s had built their first homes not by raising walls above the ground, but by cutting down into it, excavating room from the earth itself, roofing them with sod or salvaged timber, and living in them through winters that killed people who had built conventional frame houses. The author was not romanticizing this. He was reporting it as a matter of agricultural record. But partway through the second paragraph, almost as an aside, he had written a single sentence that Clara read 4 times in a row before she set the paper down. At a depth of 5 feet, the temperature of the ground remains nearly constant throughout the year, ranging between 45 and 55 degrees regardless of surface conditions. She sat on the edge of the bed with the paper in her hands and the fire behind her, and the darkness pressed against the windows and the sound of Owen's breathing in the corner. And she thought about that sentence for a long time. 45 to 55 degrees, not warm. A room held at 50 degrees was cold by any comfortable standard, cold enough to see your breath on a still morning, cold enough that sleeping in it without adequate blankets would be unpleasant. But 50 degrees was not 30 degrees. 50 degrees was not 20 degrees. 50 degrees was not the temperature at which a 5-year-old boy's foot turned the color of a winter sky. And the sentence said regardless of surface conditions, which meant regardless of what the air above was doing, regardless of the wind, regardless of the storms that came down from the northern ridges and pushed the thermometer to places that made it seem like a bad joke. 5 feet down, the earth held its temperature, the way a stone holds the warmth of a fire, slowly, steadily, not brilliantly but reliably, which was better than brilliantly, which was in fact exactly what she needed. She did not sleep again that night. Instead, she sat by the fire and worked through the problem the way she worked through all practical problems, by breaking it into its component parts and addressing each one in order. The first question was structural. She had grown up in Kansas in a house her father had built on a stone foundation, and she understood at least approximately the relationship between a building's foundation and its floor. The cabin sat on corner posts, not a continuous foundation, which meant the perimeter of the floor was unsupported between posts. If she excavated directly beneath the cabin, she would be removing earth that was currently doing nothing structural, since the cabin's weight was carried by the posts rather than by the ground between them. Elias Crane had built the cabin on posts precisely because it was cheaper and faster than laying a stone foundation. And this decision, made for reasons of economy in 1885, had inadvertently created the condition that made what Clara was now contemplating possible. The second question was thermal. A room excavated to a depth of 5 feet would have walls at a temperature of roughly 50 degrees, possibly slightly higher, if the heat from the cabin above conducted down through the floor. The air inside such a room, protected from wind and insulated by several feet of earth on all sides, would stabilize at something close to the wall temperature. Not immediately, but over time, with a lamp burning with body heat from 2 children sleeping. The temperature of such a room could reasonably be expected to hold in the low 50s, even when the surface temperature outside dropped to numbers that appeared on no thermometer Clara owned. The third question was practical. She was one woman with a shovel, 2 young children who needed supervision, a finite supply of candles and lamp oil, and a settlement full of people who were already watching her with the particular attention that communities direct toward individuals who are known to be struggling and are observed to be doing something unusual about it. She pulled her coat from the hook by the door and went outside into the dark. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. She crossed the frozen yard to the cabin's north wall and crouched down and pressed her fingers into the ground just inside the foundation line. The surface was frozen hard, locked and gray. She pushed her fingers deeper, pressing past the first resistance, and felt the earth shift slightly under the pressure of her knuckles. Not soft but yielding, maybe 8 inches down, maybe 10. She went back inside and sat down at the table and began to make a list. The doctor, or rather, the man who served as the settlement's closest approximation of a doctor, was named Aldous Firth, and he was primarily a veterinarian who had acquired enough general medical knowledge over 30 years of practice to be trusted with human patients when there was no alternative. He had examined Owen in October at Clara's request, pressing his wide hands against the boy's small back, listening to his breathing through a tube of his own construction, and then he had straightened up and looked at Clara with the direct, unsparing expression of a man who had learned that delay in delivering difficult information serves no one. Owen had a weakness in the lower portion of his left lung. Firth explained a congenital narrowing that made him susceptible to congestion in ways that a healthy child would not be. In warm weather, in dry conditions, it was nearly undetectable. In cold, wet conditions, particularly conditions involving sustained exposure to cold air, it became significant. Thomas had known about this, Firth added in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a known fact rather than delivering a revelation, because Thomas had brought the boy to Firth the previous winter with exactly this concern. Clara had stood in Firth's small examination room and absorbed this in the stillness that had become her primary response to difficulty. Thomas had known. Thomas had not told her. She did not know what to do with this information about her dead husband, so she set it aside in the way she set aside things she could not immediately use, not forgetting them, but not addressing them either, filing them in some interior space where they would wait. What she did not set aside was the rest of what Firth said. Another winter like the last one, and the boy was in serious trouble. The odds got worse every time they put him through it. She had nodded and taken Owen home and put him to bed and sat by the fire for a long time that night. And what she had understood sitting there was that the information about Thomas's silence and the information about Owen's lung were two separate facts, and only one of them could be acted on, and she knew which one. When she finally told Elias Crane what she was planning, it was not because she wanted his opinion. It was because Elias Crane was the kind of man who found out about things whether you told him or not, and being told was slightly better for everyone than being discovered. She described the basic plan in 2 sentences in the doorway of the general store. She was going to excavate a room beneath the cabin floor linet with river stone and use it as a sleeping space for the children during the coldest months. She had thought through the structural implications. She was confident it could be done without affecting the cabin's integrity. Elias Crane was 61 years old and had been building structures in Montana for 22 years. He was not a cruel man. He was a man whose entire professional identity was built around the things he had built, which meant that anything that challenged the adequacy of those things was experienced by him not as a neutral disagreement, but as something more personal. He listened to Clara's 2 sentences with the particular stillness of someone who is preparing a response rather than actually listening. And when she finished, he said that if she dug beneath the floor he had laid on those posts, the post would shift, the floor would sag, and whatever she thought she was building would become the thing that brought the cabin down on top of her children. He was not saying this to be cruel. He believed it. And genuine belief stated with authority by a man who has built 43 structures in a valley and can name every one of them carries a weight that is different from the weight of mere opinion. What reason do you have for thinking the cold comes from above and not below? Clara asked. He looked at her with the expression of a man who finds the question slightly impertinent. Because that's how cold works, he said. It comes down from the air. Any room you dig in the ground will be colder than the cabin above it, not warmer. She did not explain the Prairie Farmer article. She did not explain what she knew about ground temperature at depth, about the insulating mass of 5 feet of earth, about the difference between the temperature of the air and the temperature of the ground. She had learned from 32 years of being a woman in conversations with men who were certain they were right, that explaining the flaw in a man's reasoning while he was still in the process of being certain was rarely productive. "I appreciate you telling me," she said, and went back into the store to pay for her lamp oil. That evening, she stood outside in the dark for the second time, crouching at the north wall, and she pressed her fingers into the soil again. She was not checking the temperature. She was checking whether the feeling she had. The feeling that she was right and that Elias Crane was wrong, and that the difference between those two positions was the difference between her children surviving the winter and not surviving it, whether that feeling held when she was alone and cold and the darkness was complete on all sides. She pressed her fingers into the earth and felt it yield below the frost line and held that sensation in her mind and let it tell her what it had to tell her. It held. She went back inside and covered Owen's feet with an extra blanket and sat down at the table with a scrap of paper and a pencil and drew a rectangle representing the room she intended to build. 8 feet long, 6 feet wide. Walls of riverstone, dry stacked and tight. A sleeping platform raised off the floor. A ventilation pipe angled up through the cabin floor and out through the foundation. She looked at what she had drawn for a long time. Then she added the ladder. She started before dawn the next morning. Chester Dunn ran the general store and served as the settlement's unofficial ledger of who owed what to whom. He was not a dishonest man. The prices he charged were fair by the standards of the territory, and he extended credit more liberally than a strictly commercial operation would have justified. But he was a precise man, and precision about money required that the terms of obligation be stated clearly and revisited regularly. He came to the cabin on a Tuesday in late November, earlier than Clara had expected, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the interior with the careful neutrality of a man cataloging assets. The loom, the iron stove, the cast iron pot, the china lamp on the table. He looked at these things not with desire, but with assessment. The debt was $42 accumulated over the previous 8 months in small increments. He told her he would need it settled by the 10th of January, or he would need to collect against assets. He was apologetic in the way of men who are doing something they regard as regrettable but necessary. He did not say which assets. They were both looking at the same room. After he left, Clara sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at her pencil drawing. The debt was a new variable. It was not insurmountable, but it changed the calculation in one specific way. She could not afford to burn extra firewood trying to heat the cabin from above. Every cord of wood she burned unnecessarily was money she did not have to pay Chester Dunn, which meant the underground room was no longer merely a better solution to the problem of cold. It was the only solution to 2 problems simultaneously, and the fact that it addressed both with the same action was not lost on her. She picked up the pencil and added a ventilation line to her drawing. She was sure enough now. She was done deliberating. The second week of digging was different from the first in the way that the second week of any hard thing is different from the first. The first week carries the momentum of decision, the forward energy of a choice recently made and not yet tested by its full consequences. The second week strips that away and leaves only the work itself, the reality of how long it actually takes to move Earth with a single shovel in the hours before dawn and after dark. What sustained physical labor does to a body that is also managing a household and 2 children and a dwindling woodpile, and the arithmetic of a debt that does not pause because the debtor is busy. Her hands had passed through the blister stage and arrived at something harder. The skin across her palms had thickened and darkened, and the joints of her fingers ached with a deep stiffness that took 20 minutes of movement to loosen each morning. She had begun sleeping on the floor beside the hearth rather than in the bed, not because she preferred it, but because lying flat on the hard surface meant she could push herself upright without engaging the muscles along her spine that had begun to protest every other position. She told Lily when the girl asked that she slept better near the fire. Lily was 8 and perceptive and did not believe this, but she did not press because she was also the kind of child who understood instinctively when a question would cost more than its answer was worth. The room below was taking shape in ways the original plan had not fully anticipated. The soil at 4 feet depth was different from the soil above it, denser and darker with a heaviness that suggested it had been compressed by centuries of weight rather than merely by seasons. It was harder to move, but more stable once moved the walls of the excavation, holding their shape with less tendency to crumble than the looser soil above. Clara developed a rhythm for it, two short angled strikes to loosen one deeper stroke, to lift the sequence repeated until the motion became reflexive enough that she could perform it in near darkness, with only the small oil lamp casting its yellow circle against the earthen walls. She was 4 feet down and roughly half the intended floor area complete when the north wall showed the first crack. It appeared on a Monday morning, a diagonal line running from a point near the top of the excavation wall down to a point near its base, perhaps 14 inches long, the width of a finger at its widest. The soil around it had shifted slightly. The wall face no longer perfectly vertical, but leaning inward by a degree that was small but was not zero. Clara crouched in front of it for a long time with the lamp held close, not touching it, just looking. The crack had the quality of something that had happened recently. The edges still sharp, the displaced soil still loose at the base of the line. It had probably happened overnight when the temperature outside dropped sharply after 2 days of warmer weather, and the freeze-thaw cycle put stress on the upper layers of soil, which meant it could happen again, which meant the wall without reinforcement was not stable. She thought about what Elias Crane had said and considered the possibility that he had been right about this specific thing, even if his reasoning about everything else was wrong. A room with collapsing walls was not a shelter. It was a trap. She sat on her heels in the cold, earthy dark and worked through the problem, and arrived at the answer the Prairie Farmer article had been pointing toward all along. The dugout builders in Nebraska had not left their walls as bare earth. They had lined them. Stone was what she had. The creek bed was a quarter mile from the cabin, and between those two facts lay a series of cold mornings and heavy loads that she was already calculating before she had fully stood up. She began hauling stone the following morning. The creek bed offered an abundance of rounded river rock, smooth oblate forms that stacked well and locked against each other under pressure without requiring mortar. She loaded them into the wheelbarrow Thomas had used for the garden, 6 or 8 at a time, depending on size, and moved them to the cabin before full light. It took 4 trips to accumulate enough stone for a single course along the north wall. It would take many more for the rest. It was on the 3rd morning of hauling stone that Elias Crane appeared at the edge of the path, and this time he did not come alone. Old Silas was with him, and behind Silas were 2 men from the church, whose presence communicated something clearly about how the morning had been arranged. Elias looked at the wheelbarrow loaded with river rock and ran a calculation that was faster than the one he had run with the soil bag, because he already had most of the information. He understood exactly what she was doing. The stone quantity told him the scale of it. He said what he had come to say in front of witnesses loudly enough to be heard at the fence line, that if the floor shifted, if the posts moved even half an inch, she would lose the north wall and her children would be inside the cabin when it went. He was not performing anger. He was performing certainty. The certainty of a man who has built his reputation over 2 decades and is not willing to let someone else's decisions be mistaken for his own work. Clara set the wheelbarrow handles down. She looked at him with the steadiness she had been practicing since October, since the morning with the frozen bucket, since the night with Owen's blue foot, since the evening she had pressed her hands into the earth and trusted what she felt. "You build the floor on posts," she said. "I'm building what's underneath the posts in soil that has never supported anything. We are not working on the same structure." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know what I'm doing," Clara said, and picked up the wheelbarrow handles and continued toward the cabin. She heard him say something to old Silas as she walked away, something short and sharp that she did not catch. She did not turn around. The space between her shoulder blades felt exposed in the way it does when you are walking away from a confrontation that is not finished, only paused. Ruth Halsey came that evening. She came without announcement. A tap at the door in the early darkness, the smell of cold air coming in when Clara opened it. Ruth stepped inside and looked at the room with the quick inventory of someone who has been imagining what she might find and is measuring the reality against the imagination. Her expression was not the expression of a woman who had come to offer or to judge. It was the expression of a woman who had come because she needed something and was still deciding how to ask for it. Her youngest, she explained, was 3 years old, a girl named June. June had been sick since October, with a congestion in her chest that came and went but never fully cleared. And the cold nights made it worse, and Ruth's husband had been away in Helena since September, dealing with a land dispute, and she had been managing the winter alone. And the previous night, June had coughed until she gagged, and Ruth had held her in the rocking chair until 4 in the morning, while the fire burned low because she had been afraid to set her down. Clara poured her a cup of tea from the pot on the hearth and set it in front of her without a word. They sat across from each other at the small table in the firelight, and Ruth wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at its surface and did not speak again for a long moment. Two women in the same situation, Clara thought, on opposite sides of the same winter. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable because it was full of the specific understanding that comes from shared difficulty rather than shared ease. "How long cheese?" Ruth asked finally, "until it's finished." 2 weeks at her, Clara said. "Maybe less." Ruth nodded once, the nod of a person filing information rather than responding to it, and drank her tea and left 20 minutes later without asking anything further. No request had been made. No promise had been given. Something had been established between them anyway, in the particular way that two women managing the same kind of difficulty can establish things without naming them through the bare fact of sitting together in a warm room and acknowledging without words that the warmth was not guaranteed, and that both of them knew it and neither of them intended to accept it lying down. Owen's worst night came on a Thursday in the 3rd week, 4 days before Clara estimated she would complete the room. The cough started around midnight, and this time it did not stop after a few minutes and settled back into the rougher-than-normal breathing she had come to consider his baseline. It continued and deepened and changed quality, the dryness giving way to something wetter and more labored. And Clara was out of bed and at his side before she had fully processed the decision to move. She held him upright against her chest and walked him in slow circles around the cabin, the way she had walked him as an infant when the nights were bad, his small weight against her shoulder, his breathing measured against the side of her neck. Lily woke and sat up and watched them circle the room with the grave attentiveness of a child who has learned that the proper response to a crisis you cannot fix is to bear witness to it without adding to its weight. 3 circuits, 4, 5. Somewhere in the 6th, the wet quality in Owen's cough began to ease the congestion, loosening slightly with movement and warmth. And by the 10th circuit, his breathing had returned to the familiar rough baseline, and by the 15th, he was asleep against her shoulder. She stood still in the center of the room, holding him, feeling the rise and fall of his chest against hers, and thought about 2 weeks, and then thought about 4 days, and made a calculation about which of those numbers she could actually control. She worked the next 2 nights without sleeping. Not a decision she announced. Not a decision she particularly made, just the outcome of a simple arithmetic. She drank coffee she made strong enough to be unpleasant, and she went down through the floor in the dark, and she moved stone and she moved soil, and she kept the lamp trimmed low to conserve oil, and worked by feel as much as by sight in the sections she had already laid and knew by touch. The stone walls went up course by course, each layer slightly inside the one below, to lean into the earth rather than away from it, the way she had seen retaining walls built along creek banks. She packed dry pine needles and strips of birch bark into the gap between the stone face and the raw earth behind it, filling the space with material that would trap air and slow the exchange of temperature between the earthen wall and the room interior. The floor she left as packed soil leveled with a hand board, slightly higher at the center, to encourage any moisture to move toward the edges. She built the sleeping platform from the cedar boards she had removed from the floor above, supported on flat stones, raising it 8 inches off the ground, enough to stay above any moisture that might collect at floor level in the shoulder seasons. The ventilation pipe was the most technically demanding part of the construction, and she had been thinking about it since November. She needed to move air through the room without creating a channel for wind. She used a length of 3-inch stovepipe she found in the woodshed, a leftover section from when Thomas had extended the kitchen stovepipe 2 years before. She angled it up through the cabin floor at 45 degrees, running it through the original floor joists and out through the foundation on the south side, where it emerged at ground level behind a cedar post and was easily mistaken for a drainage outlet. The angle prevented wind from driving directly down into the room. The diameter allowed sufficient air exchange for a lamp and 2 people to breathe safely. She tested it with the lamp burning and a damp cloth held at the pipe's interior end, watching the cloth for movement. It moved, not dramatically, not in the way of a draft, but with the slow, steady, barely perceptible motion of air, doing exactly what it was designed to do. On the morning of December 16th, she climbed down into the finished room for the first time and sat on the sleeping platform and looked at what 3 weeks of work had produced. The walls were dry and solid, the stone courses tight and even. The platform was level. The lamp burned without flickering. She had hung the small thermometer she owned on a nail driven into the mortar between 2 stones at shoulder height, and she looked at it now in the lamplight and read the number it offered. 54 degrees. Outside at that moment, the thermometer beside the cabin door read 11 degrees. The difference between those 2 numbers was 43 degrees, and those 43 degrees were not produced by burning anything. They were produced by going down, by placing 5 feet of earth between 2 children and the wind that came off the northern ridges at night. She sat there for a long time in the quiet. The room had a quality of stillness that the cabin above never had, even on calm days. There was no creak of boards, no settling of logs, no whisper of air through gaps she had never fully been able to seal. There was simply the deep, indifferent silence of the earth, the silence of something that has been here for longer than any human structure, and will be here when all human structures are gone. The silence that has nothing to prove and nothing to lose. She climbed back up and stood in the cabin, and looked at the rug she had laid over the trapdoor, and thought about how to tell the children. She made supper first, a proper 1 dried beans with salt pork, and the last of the preserved onions, and she let the children eat until they were satisfied. And then she sat them at the table in the firelight, and told them without preamble that she had built a room under the floor, and she was going to show it to them. Lily's face moved through a sequence of expressions that Clara had come to recognize as her daughter's version of rapid processing. Surprise, skepticism, calculation, and then a careful, neutral interest. That meant she had decided to withhold judgment until she had more information. Owen simply slid off the bench and walked to the rug and stood on it and looked up at Clara as though he was waiting for the next instruction. Clara moved the rug and lifted the trapdoor and went down first with the lamp. And Owen came down immediately after, his small boots finding the ladder rungs, with the sure-footedness of a child who has never been told that certain things should be frightening. He stood on the earthen floor and looked at the stone walls, and then pressed his open palm against the nearest course of stone and held it there. The stone was not warm, not by any comfortable standard. But it was not the cold that made his foot go the color of a winter sky. It was the temperature of something sheltered, something held. "It's not cold," he said, his voice carrying the simple, absolute satisfaction of a statement that does not require embellishment. Lily came down last carefully, 1 rung at a time, and stood at the base of the ladder and looked around the room with the lamp casting moving shadows on the stone walls. She did not touch anything for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara and asked the question that Clara had not anticipated and probably should have. "Did you build this by yourself?" "Yes," Clara said. Lily looked at the walls, at the careful courses of stone, at the packed needle insulation, visible in the gap above the top course, at the ventilation pipe angling up through the ceiling, at the level platform with its cedar boards. She looked at Clara's hands, at the thickened, calloused palms, at the still swollen knuckles. Then she looked back at the room. Something shifted in her face, not the dramatic shift of revelation, but the quieter shift of a child updating her understanding of what her mother is capable of. The kind of update that once made cannot be unmade. She sat down on the sleeping platform and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the lamp flame. That was enough. 4 days later, Chester Dunn came for the debt payment, and Clara paid him from the money she had set aside from selling excess firewood to a family at the edge of the settlement who had underestimated their winter supply. She had excess firewood because the underground room had already reduced her nightly consumption by more than a third. The fire above banked low at night, rather than driven hard, the earth's steady offering, doing the work that had previously required constant burning. Chester counted the bills and coins on the table and looked at the stack of cordwood still visible through the window. "How much did you burn?" he asked, his voice carrying the particular interest of a man who tracks consumption the way other men track weather. "Less than half a cord," Clara said. He stood for a moment in the doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, the expression of a man who had come expecting one kind of transaction and found instead that the terms had changed in a way he did not yet understand. He put his hat on and left without further questions. Outside, past the shuttered windows, the first clouds of the season's worst storm were massing over the northern ridges, and the wind was beginning to find its voice in the gaps between the cabin logs. And somewhere in the settlement, Elias Crane was stacking what remained of his firewood and arriving at a number that would not be long enough. The storm arrived without ceremony. What happened was a gradual and then sudden erasure. The mountains to the north disappearing first behind low cloud, then the ridge line, then the tree line, then the distance between Clara's cabin and the next nearest structure, until the world outside the windows was simply white and moving and without edge or boundary. By the afternoon of January 11th, the temperature had dropped 12 degrees in 4 hours. By nightfall, it had dropped 12 more. The wind that came with the snow was not the wind that rattled shutters and moved loose objects on porch rails. It was the kind of wind that reorganized the landscape, that found every gap in every structure the settlement contained and pushed through it with the focused curiosity of something testing for weakness. She kept the fire high that first night and did not go below. She needed to stay calibrated to what the surface conditions actually were, rather than insulating herself from them before she needed to. She took notes on a scrap of paper. Temperature at 9 in the evening, with the fire fully stoked, 52 degrees at shoulder height, 38 degrees at floor level. Temperature at midnight with the fire banked to half, 46 degrees at shoulder height, 31 degrees at floor level. Wood consumed in 3 hours at full burn, slightly more than a quarter of the smallest rick. She looked at that last number and looked at the woodpile through the frost-edged window and did the division in her head. The second day took the temperature to 18 below by mid-morning. Clara went out twice for wood, and both times the cold hit her face with a physical force that was difficult to describe as anything other than violent. The air itself behaving like something with intent. She moved fast and kept her face down, and was back inside before her fingers went from aching to numb. But the second time she came in, she stood by the fire for 5 full minutes before she could close her right hand completely. The news about the Granger family reached her on the 4th day, carried by old Silas, who moved between cabins in storms with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who has decided that weather is a circumstance rather than an obstacle. He knocked and came inside and stood by the fire without removing his coat, and told her that the Grangers' youngest, a boy not yet 2, had died in the night. The fire in their cabin had gone out sometime after midnight, and the family had not woken to relight it. He said this in the plain declarative tone he used for all difficult information, without softening and without embellishment. Because he had learned over a long life that plain information delivered plainly is kinder than plain information wrapped in gentleness. Because gentleness implies the listener needs protection from the truth. And most people do not need protection from the truth as much as they need to be trusted with it. Clara received it the same way he delivered it. She thanked him. She gave him a cup of coffee and a piece of cornbread, and he sat for 20 minutes warming himself, and then went back out into the white. She stood at the window after he left and looked at nothing for a long moment. And then she turned and looked at her children, and felt the weight of the Granger boy's name, which she did not know, sitting on her chest like a stone placed there carefully by someone who meant it as a reminder rather than a punishment. That night, the temperature inside the cabin, with the fire burning as hard as she dared, pushed a drop to 38 degrees. She watched the thermometer reach that number and held the image of the Granger cabin in her mind. The extinguished fire, the cold that moved in when the fire moved out, the irreversible arithmetic of a room that loses heat faster than a sleeping family can generate it. Then she looked at the rug over the trapdoor. She woke the children without dramatics. She told them they were going below, her voice carrying the same tone she used when she told them supper was ready or it was time to bring in wood, the tone of ordinary necessary things. Owen was awake and moving before she finished the sentence. Lily took slightly longer, surfacing from sleep with the reluctance of a child who sleeps deeply. But when she was fully awake, she moved with a quiet efficiency that Clara recognized as her daughter's version of competence under pressure, doing what needed doing without requiring the situation to be explained or justified first. Clara banged the fire to its minimum, just enough to keep the chimney warm and prevent the flue from icing shut. She took the lamp and the extra oil and the bag of dried apples and the cornbread wrapped in cloth and the 2 extra blankets, and she handed things to the children to carry, and they carried them, and she opened the trap door and went down first, and they followed. When the trap door closed above them, the change was immediate and absolute. The wind, which had been a constant presence in the cabin, above a vibration in the walls and a pressure against every surface, simply stopped. Not diminished, stopped. The silence that replaced it was the silence of the underground room, and it had a quality that Clara had noticed on her first descent, but had not fully absorbed until now, sitting on the sleeping platform with her children on either side of her, and the lamp burning between them, the quality of permanence. The storm was directly above them, pressing down on the floor 6 inches over their heads, and it was entirely irrelevant. The thermometer read 56 degrees. Lily pulled her knees to her chest and looked at the lamp flame and said something that Clara would turn over in her mind for years afterward. The way you turn over something small and dense that keeps revealing new surfaces. It sounds like outside is very far away, Lily said, her voice thoughtful rather than frightened. The voice of someone making an accurate observation about a surprising fact. They stayed below for 4 days. Clara went up twice each day to tend the fire, moving quickly through the cold cabin, adding wood, checking the flue. Each ascent was a brief immersion in a world that had become hostile in a way that felt almost impersonal. The cold not targeting her specifically, but simply being what it was everywhere and indifferent. Each descent back through the trap door was a return to the room that held its temperature, with the patient constancy of the earth itself, above between 35 and 42 degrees. Below 54 to 57 degrees, the variation so small, it was almost not variation at all. Owen did not cough once in those 4 days. She noticed this on the 2nd day and watched for it specifically on the 3rd and 4th. It did not come. His breathing in the underground room was the breathing of a child whose lungs were getting what they had always needed: warmth and stillness and air that was not moving at speed through frozen passages. In its absence, she understood more clearly than she had before exactly how present the cough had always been. She lay awake listening to its absence with a fullness in her chest that she did not have a name for and did not need one. On the morning of the 5th day, the wind dropped. Not all at once, but with the gradual deceleration of something that has expended itself fully and is now winding down. Clara went up at dawn and stood in the cabin and heard the difference: the walls no longer under lateral pressure, the logs quiet, the fire burning upright in the hearth. She went to the door and opened it and looked out at a world that had been entirely rearranged. Snow 4 feet deep in the yard, deeper where it had drifted against the woodshed and the north wall. The sky was the pale, clear blue of extreme cold following a major storm, a color that was beautiful in the way of things that are also dangerous. The settlement was beginning. She could hear it to emerge. Ruth Halsey came first, moving through the snow with the purposeful stride of a woman who has been waiting to check on something. She was carrying a pot of broth still warm, and she came through the door and looked at Clara, and then looked at the children, and then looked at the room, taking in the low fire, the 2 extra cords of wood still stacked outside the window. The general condition of a household that had not been in crisis. Her face when she looked back at Clara carried something complicated in it. Relief was part of it. The relief of someone who had prepared herself for a harder scene. But beneath the relief was the expression of a person who has been shown by simple contrast the gap between what was possible and what they had been managing. Her daughter June, she said, was recovering, slowly, still coughing through the nights. Ruth set the broth pot on the table and sat down and looked at her hands for a moment, and then looked up with the directness that Clara had come to understand was her way of asking for something, without framing it as a request. "Show me," she said. Clara moved the rug and opened the trap door, and Ruth came down the ladder and stood on the earthen floor of the room. She walked slowly along the stone wall, dragging 2 fingers across the surface, feeling the temperature through her fingertips, her face doing the arithmetic. She moved to the thermometer and leaned close and read the number, and stood back and looked at the room entire, the platform, the pipe, the packed needles visible above the top course of stone. Then she turned around, and her expression had resolved into something simple and decided. "My foundation is continuous stone on the east side," she said, "only 12 inches deep where it meets the kitchen floor." A pause. "But 12 inches is a start." "12 inches is enough to begin," Clara said. "Build the stone lining before you go deeper. The wall will hold." Ruth climbed back up the ladder and picked up her empty broth pot and left with the same purposeful stride she had arrived with, moving through the snow toward her own cabin and whatever calculations she was now running about the east side of her kitchen floor. 3 days later, Clara heard the faint, unmistakable rhythm of a shovel working frozen ground from the direction of the Halsey place, and she felt hearing it the particular quiet satisfaction of a useful thing being passed from one pair of hands to another. Elias Crane came on the 3rd day after the storm. Clara heard his boots on the porch before the knock. The distinctive heavy tread she had learned to identify by sound alone, and she opened the door before he finished knocking. He stood on the porch in his heavy coat with his hat in his hands, and she saw immediately that something had changed in him. Not a softening exactly, nothing that dramatic. What had changed was the set of his shoulders. The particular way a man who has always carried his certainty like good posture begins to carry it differently when the certainty has been tested and found to be something less absolute than he believed. His left hand was wrapped in cloth, 2 fingers bound together, in the way bound frostbitten tissue when the damage was real but not irreversible. He looked at her with the direct look of a man who has decided that a thing needs to be done and has arrived to do it. "My wife was sick," he said. "She's better now." He stopped. He was clearly not finished, but was choosing words with the care of someone saying something for the first time, something that does not yet have a practiced form. "I burned the chair I brought from Ohio," he said, "the sewing rocker, and the small table from the bedroom. I burned them both." Another pause. "I used 3 cords of wood, and my family still came close." He looked at his wrapped hand and then looked back at her. "I said things about your floor, about what would happen. I said them in front of people." "You believed them," Clara said. "I did." His jaw was set, but his eyes were level in the way of a man who has decided on honesty and intends to see it through. "I was wrong about the temperature. The cold doesn't come from the ground. I understand that now." He looked past her into the cabin, at the rug over the trapdoor, at the 2 extra cords of wood still stacked outside the window. "I told people this would fail. I need to tell them it didn't. The next Sunday, before the pastor began his sermon, Elias Crane stood up in the church and turned to face the congregation and said what he had to say. His voice was steady and without decoration. He had told people that Clara Morrow's idea was wrong and would cause harm. He had been wrong. The idea worked. Anyone who wanted help building the same thing in their own cabin could come to him, and he would help them build it properly, and at no charge, because the least a man could do when he had used his reputation to discourage something useful was to use that same reputation to encourage it. He sat back down. The pastor waited a moment and then began his sermon as though nothing unusual had happened, because in his experience the most effective moral statements were the ones that did not require commentary. Clara sat in her pew 2 rows behind Elias and looked at the back of his head and thought about what it cost a man like him to stand up in a room full of people who had trusted his judgment and revise it out loud. It was not a small thing. It was possibly the largest thing he had done, larger than any of the 43 structures he had built, because those had been built with skills he already possessed. And this had required him to build something he had never built before. By the end of January, 4 families had begun excavating beneath their cabin floors. By February 6, Chester Dunn came to the store one morning and asked her the same questions Howard Pruitt would ask 2 years later. How deep, what stone, how did the air move? And Clara answered all of them with the same plain, declarative patience she had used with Elias, because the information was not proprietary and never had been. It had come from a newspaper article written by an unnamed man about people who had been dead for a decade. And before that, it had come from the ground itself, which had been holding its temperature at 5 feet, regardless of surface conditions, since long before anyone had thought to measure it. Howard Pruitt arrived in April of 1889. A compact man in his 40s with the organized mind of someone accustomed to reducing complex situations to their reportable essentials. He was an agricultural land agent for the territorial government, compiling data on winter survival rates across Montana settlements, and the numbers from Bitterroot Creek were anomalous compared to neighboring communities. Anomalous numbers had explanations, and explanations were what his report required. Clara told him everything. She showed him the room, explained the construction, described the thermal principles as she understood them from the Prairie Farmer article and from 3 months of her own observation. She gave him the temperature records she had kept on her scraps of paper, the wood consumption figures, the comparison between above and below during the worst nights of the storm. Pruitt wrote all of it down in a small, precise hand, filling 4 pages of his notebook, and when he left, he shook her hand in the businesslike way of someone concluding a transaction and said her information would be useful. Clara had no particular reason to think the usefulness would extend much beyond his report, and she turned back to her garden and did not think about it again. She was wrong about that, but she would not know it for 2 years. The letter arrived in April of 1891, addressed in a hand she did not recognize, routed through Chester Dunn's general store, with a notation on the envelope that read in careful block letters for the woman who dug the room at Bitterroot Creek, Montana territory. Chester brought it to her with an expression suggesting he found this form of address personally affronting in its imprecision. Clara held the envelope for a moment before opening it and felt something she did not immediately identify, a kind of stillness, the feeling of something completed. The letter was from a woman in Cheyenne, Wyoming, whose name was Frances Alderman. Frances had a son 4 years old with a respiratory condition that had made each winter a sustained negotiation with the possibility of losing him. Her husband had read Pruitt's agricultural report the previous year, the section with the notation about earth-sheltered sleeping quarters and the Bitterroot Creek method, and had spent the fall of 1890 excavating a room beneath the floor of their kitchen. The boy had spent the winter of 1890 to 1891 below ground on the coldest nights, and he had survived it well better than any previous winter. His breathing clear in the mornings in a way it had never been before. Frances wanted the woman who had made this possible to know that her son was alive and well, and had recently learned to write his own name. Clara read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands. She thought about the Prairie Farmer article, the half column in the September 1879 issue, the unnamed author, who had described the Nebraska dugout builders with plain declarative clarity. She thought about how the article had traveled from that unnamed author to Thomas's wooden box, to her hands, to a room beneath her floor, to Howard Pruitt's notebook, to a report to a man in Cheyenne, to a room beneath his kitchen, to a boy who could now write his own name. She thought about all the hands a useful truth passes through on its way to the person who needs it, and how none of those hands is the origin of the truth. How the truth was always already there in the ground at 5 feet at 45 to 55 degrees, waiting for someone to stop building upward long enough to look down. She set the letter on the table and went to the window and looked out at the spring yard, at the garden beds coming back to life in the pale April light, at the ground thawing and darkening and releasing the mineral smell of earth returning to itself after the long hold of winter. The trap door under the rug behind her was still there and would remain there. The room below was still 52 degrees. In June, it would be 53 or 54, the earth shifting its temperature by increments so small they were almost not movement at all. The deep ground changing with the seasons the way very old things change perceptibly, but without urgency, at the pace of something that has all the time it needs. Thomas had kept the Prairie Farm article in his wooden box for years, Clara thought. He had folded it carefully and kept it at the bottom of everything else beneath the letters. He never answered. And the photograph of his parents and the almanac he used until the cover fell off. She did not know if he had kept it because he intended someday to act on it, or because he simply recognized it as a thing worth preserving. She had spent 3 years wondering what else he had known and not said, wondering whether the silence about Owen's lung was a failure or a protection, or simply the thing it was, a man carrying a weight alone that he should have shared. She did not think about it with anger anymore. She thought about it with the particular understanding that comes from having carried weights alone yourself, and knowing how it feels from the inside, how it is possible to believe, genuinely believe, that you are protecting someone by not telling them, and how that belief can be wrong in ways you will never live to correct. She had kept the article. She had used it. That was what she could do. That was what she had done. James Aldrich came into her life in the summer of 1894, which is a different story told in different light. But what is relevant here is what happened on his first winter night in the cabin, when the temperature outside dropped to 15 below, and Clara moved the rug and opened the trap door and explained matter-of-factly that they would be sleeping below. He came down the ladder without comment and lay on the platform and was quiet for a long time. The lamp was burning low nearly at the end of its oil, and the room was settling into its nighttime temperature of 53 degrees. And the silence was the silence she had come to know over 7 winters. The silence that has no wind in it. "I've never heard nothing before," James said, his voice carrying the genuine surprise of a man who has lived 50 years and encountered something he did not know was possible. "I didn't know nothing had a sound." Clara reached up and turned the lamp wick down to its final thread of light, and the room went dark in the way only underground rooms go dark completely and without gradation. And she lay still and listened to the nothing. He was talking about the total and encompassing quiet of the earth, holding its temperature and its silence around them, like something it had been keeping in trust. She thought that this was the sound that had been there the whole time, under every storm, under every winter, under every night she had spent listening to Owen breathe and measuring the cold by the frost on the floorboards. It had been there before she dug. It had been there before the cabin. It had been there before anyone had built anything on this valley floor, waiting for someone to come down far enough to hear it. Not the silence of absence, the silence of depth, the silence of something that does not need the wind to tell it what it is. Lily grew up and built her own room below her own floor in Idaho before she laid a single log above it, understanding instinctively that shelter begins below the surface rather than above it. Owen became a stonemason whose dry-stacked walls were known across Missoula for their precision and permanence, and he never called what he did by any name beyond good work, because that was the name it had always had. The underground room he had first entered as a 5-year-old boy, pressing his palm against stone and reporting with simple satisfaction that it was not cold had shaped the way he understood every structure he would ever build afterward. Not as something imposed on the earth, but as something in conversation with it, something that acknowledged what the ground already offered and built from there. The room under the Beetroot Creek cabin stood until 1931, when the County Road Commission acquired the land and the cabin came down. The crew foreman who opened the trapdoor during demolition stood on the ladder and held his lamp up, and looked at the stone walls for a long time before he climbed back out, and told his crew to leave the room intact, that whoever had built it had done it right, and it deserved better than a bulldozer. The crew worked around it for 2 days, dismantling the cabin above, while leaving the room below untouched, until the foreman finally accepted that the road grade required its removal and gave the order. But he recorded it in his work log, which was unusual. Crew foremen working road commission contracts in 1931 did not typically record the details of demolished outbuildings. He wrote, "Stone-lined underground chamber, hand-built, dry-stack construction. Approximately 8 by 6 feet, excellent condition builder, unknown. Estimated age 40 years or more." He did not know who had built it. He only knew it had been built by someone who understood that the most enduring thing a person can do is not to raise something higher than everything around it, but to go down deep enough to find the ground that does not change and to trust it and to build from there.